Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's jump right in. Today we're tackling the 1960s.
Oh, yeah.
A decade of major change for pretty much everyone, but especially for Mexican Americans.
Absolutely.
We're digging into this lecture called The Rise of Mexican American Activism in the 1960s. And it's got a lot of really interesting stuff that I honestly didn't know before.
Right.
So we're going to try to figure out, like, why this particular decade, what made it such a turning point?
Yeah, good question.
And of course, we got to talk about, like, the big names, the leaders, the organizations that were really driving this movement.
Yeah, you can't forget them.
And then, what was the lasting impact? What are we still seeing today because of what happened back then?
Yeah, like what's the legacy,
Exactly. So much to uncover. But first, let's set the scene, right? Like, what was the situation for Mexican Americans before the 60s even hit?
Well, a lot of folks were struggling, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking poverty, limited education.
Right.
Not a lot of political power either.
It's hard to get your voice heard when you're dealing with all that, right?
Exactly. And a lot of people, believe it or not, still held on to this idea of maybe going back to Mexico someday.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I didn't realize that was still so prevalent.
Yeah, it was definitely a different mindset back then.
So, it's funny because when I think of the 60s, I think of, like, all this activism, all this energy for social change.
Right.
But it sounds like things were pretty quiet on that front, at least for Mexican Americans, before that decade really got going.
Yeah, I mean, quiet might be an understatement.
So what changed? Like, seriously, what flipped the switch?
Well, I think a big part of it, and I think you'll appreciate this, is that the 60s was kind of a boiling pot for a lot of different groups, not just Mexican Americans,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
The civil rights movement was really gaining steam, and I think seeing the successes of folks like Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC, it really gave people hope,
Oh, absolutely. Like, seeing that change was actually possible.
Exactly. They're like, hey, if they can do it, maybe we can too.
So it's like a proof of concept almost.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating. Okay, so that's one piece of the puzzle. What else was going on?
Well, you also had this massive shift happening with urbanization.
Right, everyone moving to the cities.
By 1968, most Mexican Americans were living in these urban barrios, and they were all facing the same issues, poor housing, job discrimination, terrible schools.
Yeah, all those systemic things.
And I think those shared struggles, they really created this sense of unity, a shared frustration.
Makes sense.
That really fueled the desire for, like, collective action,
So, like, it wasn't just about individual problems anymore. It was about something bigger.
Right, exactly.
Now, I do have to ask about the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Oh, yeah, of course.
I mean, that had to have been huge for Mexican Americans, right?
It was absolutely massive, especially when they added those amendments in 75 requiring bilingual ballots.
Wow.
It finally gave folks a real voice in the political process,
And not just a voice, but a chance to actually elect people who represented them.
Right. It was like, finally, we're getting a seat at the table.
So we've got, like, the inspiration of the civil rights movement happening, this sense of unity forming in the barrios, and then, boom, the Voting Rights Act give people actual political power.
It's like all the ingredients for a major movement just came together.
Yeah, like a perfect storm brewing. But movements don't just happen on their own, right?
True.
You need those leaders, those people who can channel all that energy and turn it into something real.
Absolutely. And when you think about Mexican American activism in the 60s, there are two names you can't ignore.
I'm guessing you're about to say.
Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta.
Of course. The dynamic duo.
They co-founded the United Farm Workers back in '62.
Yeah.
And they were really the driving force behind the whole fight for farm worker rights.
I mean, everyone knows about the Delano Grape Strike. But was there something, like, special about their approach? Something that really set them apart?
Well, one thing Chavez was brilliant at was using symbolism and theatrics to get the whole country's attention.
Okay, interesting. Give me an example.
Like in '66, when he led that 300-mile march from Delano to Sacramento.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It was grueling, but it brought the farm workers' struggle right to the steps of the Capitol building.
That's powerful.
And you can't forget that photo of Chavez and Robert Kennedy breaking bread together during the strike.
Oh, yeah. Such a powerful image.
Pure strategy.
Wow. I never thought of it that way. So it wasn't just about negotiating contracts. It was about creating this whole narrative.
Absolutely. It was about making people see the struggle,
But Chavez and Huerta weren't the only ones fighting for change,
Yeah,
right?
not even close.
Who else was making waves?
You had groups like LULAC and MAPA working tirelessly on the political front.
Okay, tell me more about those organizations.
Well, in '66, they did something pretty bold. They walked out of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission conference.
Really? Why?
They were protesting the lack of representation, basically saying we're not going to be ignored.
I bet that got people's attention.
It definitely got President Johnson's attention.
No way. What happened?
He ended up appointing Vicente Jimenez to the EEOC,
Wow.
the very first Mexican-American to hold that position.
So not only were they fighting for inclusion, but they were actually creating it.
Exactly. And that's just one example.
This is incredible. It really feels like things were shifting in a big way.
Oh, yeah.
Like Mexican Americans were finally finding their political footing, making their voices heard.
Absolutely.
But there was also this whole other thing happening, right? This explosion of cultural pride.
Ah, you're talking about the Chicano movement.
Yes. Tell me everything.
That's where things get really interesting.
The Chicano movement, it almost feels like its own thing,
Yeah.
separate from those political battles we were talking about.
Yeah, it was definitely a different vibe.
Like, what made it so unique?
Yeah.
I mean, it was kind of rebellious, right?
You said it. It was all about pushing back against that whole idea of assimilation.
Right, like, just blend in and everything will be fine.
Exactly. They were like, no, we're proud of our heritage, our language, our history.
This is who we are.
Exactly. And they demanded respect for that.
So it wasn't about fitting in. It was about carving out their own space.
Right. It was like, we're already here and we're not going anywhere.
And I bet that resonated with a lot of young Mexican Americans, especially.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you don't have to choose between your heritage and being American.
Exactly. And guys like Rodolfo, Corky, Gonzales, they really captured that feeling in their writing.
Wait, Gonzales, he wrote that poem, I Am Joaquín, right?
That's the one. It was like the anthem for the whole movement.
I remember reading that in college.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff.
Really raw, emotional, no holding back.
And it spoke to this whole generation that was like reclaiming their voice and their place in society.
It wasn't just words, right?
No way. The Chicano movement gave birth to this whole creative explosion. Murals, music, theater, literature.
Like all this energy just had to burst out.
Exactly. They were using art as a weapon, as a tool to challenge stereotypes, to inspire people.
It wasn't just about making pretty things. It was about making a statement.
Right. Those murals that started popping up in barrios, they were like declarations of identity.
This is making me think about those primary sources the lecture mentioned.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Raul Marin's book, Among the Valiant. Stories from Mexican-American veterans.
Powerful stuff.
It must have been so validating for the movement to have those stories out there.
Oh, for sure. You can feel the anger and frustration in those stories,
Like, we fought for this country, and we're still treated like second-class citizens.
Exactly. They risked their lives for freedom overseas, only to come home and face discrimination.
So it's no wonder they were ready to fight for equality here at home.
Right, and those stories resonated with so many people.
Yeah, it wasn't just an abstract idea anymore. It was real people's lives.
Exactly. It showed everyone that the fight for civil rights wasn't just some theoretical thing.
It was about real people facing real problems.
Right. And it's interesting because historians have different ways of looking at this period.
Oh yeah, the lecture talked about that a bit.
Like the progressive school versus the social history school.
Okay, remind me how those two differ.
Well, the progressive school, they really focused on the economic exploitation of Mexican Americans.
Okay.
They saw the labor movement, especially what Chavez and the UFW were doing, as like the core of the fight.
So it's about understanding how economics shaped the whole situation.
Right. But then you have the social history school, and they're bringing in a different perspective.
Look at
They focus more on the grassroots activism happening within communities, and especially the role of women.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they were often the ones organizing, leading boycotts, mobilizing people.
But not always getting the credit.
Exactly.
Right.
Historians like Vicky Ruiz have done amazing work highlighting those contributions.
It's a good reminder that movements aren't just about the big names.
Right.
It's about all those people working behind the scenes.
And those editorials from LULAC News?
Oh, right. The lecture mentioned those.
They give you this glimpse into the strategic thinking and the debates happening within these organizations.
Seeing how the sausage is made.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't just about marching and protesting. It was about figuring out the best way to make a difference.
So we've talked a lot about the struggles, the challenges, but what about the wins?
Yeah.
What were some of the concrete changes that came out of all this activism?
Well, for one thing, you saw a big jump in political representation.
Okay, like how?
By the late 60s, there was a Mexican-American senator, 3 congressmen,
Wow.
and those numbers just kept growing after that.
So they were turning all that energy into actual political power.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about politics either.
What else was happening?
Remember how we talked about the EEOC being pressured to address discriminatory hiring?
Yeah.
Well, that started to make a real difference.
So things were actually changing on the ground.
And you had federal funds flowing into schools in Mexican-American communities.
So better resources, more opportunities.
It's amazing how all those different tactics, boycotts, organizing, even celebrating their culture,
Yeah.
it all came together to create this wave of change.
It's like a perfect example of how activism can work on multiple levels.
Absolutely. And one thing that often gets overlooked is the impact this had on national awareness.
Oh,
The
interesting.
struggles of Mexican Americans, they were suddenly in the spotlight.
Yeah.
Figures like Cesar Chavez, they forced the whole country to confront these issues.
So it wasn't just about achieving specific goals, it was about changing the national conversation.
Right. And that's a huge legacy.
But there's another way of looking at this legacy, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
The revisionist school, I think it was called.
Right. They saw the Chicano movement as something even more radical.
Okay, in what way?
They argued that the mainstream civil rights movement, it often focused too much on assimilation.
Like trying to fit into the system as it was.
Exactly. But the Chicano movement was different. It was about self-determination, cultural pride, forging their own path.
So it was about challenging what it even meant to be American.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that idea, it's still powerful today.
And then there's that other school of thought, the post-colonial one, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have a whole different take on things.
Yeah, they see it through the lens of U.S. imperialism and economic dependency.
Wow, okay.
They connect it to global struggles for decolonization.
It's like putting the whole movement in this much bigger context.
Exactly. It shows how these seemingly local struggles are actually tied to these massive historical forces.
Man, we've covered so much ground here. From the context leading up to the 60s, to the key players, the achievements, the historical debates.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest question is, what does it all mean? Like, what's the lasting legacy of all this activism?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, it feels like we've just scratched the surface here. Like, it's more than just laws changing or people getting elected, you know?
I think it's about a change in how people saw themselves. The
Mhm.
60s for Mexican Americans, it was about going from the outside to the inside,
Yeah.
demanding respect, demanding equality.
And they didn't just do that through politics.
No way. The Chicano movement, that was all about cultural power.
Right, like taking pride in who they were.
Exactly. They redefined what it meant to be Mexican American in this country.
And that's something we still see today, right?
Absolutely. Think about all the social justice movements happening now. Immigrant rights, economic justice, all of that.
They all draw inspiration from what happened back in the 60s.
Yeah, it's like those seeds planted back then are still growing.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the big takeaways you hope our listeners are walking away with?
Well, first off, I hope they realize how complex this period really was.
Okay.
It wasn't just one big Mexican-American movement.
Right.
There were so many different groups, different approaches, sometimes even disagreements.
Yeah, like it wasn't all neat and tidy.
Exactly. Social change is messy. You know, it's a lot of different people with different ideas coming together.
And somehow it all worked.
Yeah, and that's the second takeaway I hope people get.
Okay.
How all those different pieces, the protests, the organizing, the cultural stuff, it all came together to create real change.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
From Chavez and the farm workers to LULC and MAPE and the whole Chicano movement.
Yeah.
It was like this perfect storm of activism.
And it wasn't just about winning specific battles.
Wow.
It was about changing how people thought about race and equality.
You got it. And that's a lesson that's still relevant today.
For sure.
No matter what issue you care about, whether it's immigration or the economy or whatever, lasting change takes a lot of different approaches.
Protests, legal battles, changing people's hearts and minds.
You got to be willing to challenge the way things are and fight for something better.
This has been so eye-opening, honestly.
Glad to hear it.
I feel like I understand this part of history so much better now.
Well, that's what we're here for.
Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive.
My pleasure. And remember, history isn't just something in a textbook.
Right.
It's alive, it's relevant, it can inspire us to make the world a better place.
So keep learning, keep exploring, keep that spirit of the 60s alive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.